Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, I'm John Fraser. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you here tonight to the fourth in a series of 7 inaugural lectures for 2015. Inaugural lectures are a highlight of our academic calendar, and this year we have a record 7 new professors presenting over the coming 4 weeks. This is in fact the second week. We had 2 wonderful weeks of inaugural lectures previously, and we have 3 more over the next 2 weeks. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the inaugural lectures, they are in fact a tradition that dates back many hundreds of years to medieval times. As long as there have been universities, there have been inaugural lectures. I should point out that even in the early times, universities were essentially a collection of professors. In those days, they were only professors. They were recruited into an elite brotherhood. They supported one another. They protected each other. They lived in very cloistered surroundings, away from the real world, answering only to themselves, their esoteric interests, but of course expecting at the same time to be handsomely remunerated. I'll leave it to you to decide whether things have changed that much since then. A tradition that has not changed in the university is the public announcement of its new professors. Inaugural lectures are a means of showcasing our most eminent staff and a celebration of an event that represents, for many, a pinnacle of their academic career. Elevation to the title of professor is not something that is taken lightly in academia. The process of selection is long and slow. It involves intense scrutiny by international peers who signal to the university that the appointee has reached a level of international reputation and eminence in their field, thus giving them a license to say anything they like, assuming that everybody's going to believe them. Inaugural lectures are also a wonderful opportunity for us as colleagues, friends, family to gather and to celebrate and to learn about the journey that has led to this wonderful achievement. The milestones, decisions, sometimes the heartbreaks, and most importantly, the mentors who have helped along the way. Tonight it's my very great pleasure to introduce tonight's inaugural speaker, Professor Peter Adams. But before I ask Nari Kirst to provide some introductory remarks, I would also like to say that tonight it's rather special for me because Peter and I are related. We are in fact distant cousins, and we are descended from a family who used to have a beautiful home where the current business school resides. And I think we were going to team together to find out whether there was some return for us from the university for offering the land. So, Peter, it's a great pleasure and a special delight for me tonight to introduce you. So I'm now going to ask Nari Kirst, who's the head of School of Population Health, to provide some introductory remarks. Nari.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's a great pleasure to introduce Peter Adams. First I want to welcome his family. I know his mum's here, at the back there. Welcome, and his kids and wife and everything. Great, it's great to see everybody here. I think it's very important to realise this is a very good family and public occasion. Now, I have to say that Peter at odd times has been a little bit irreverent at times, and so I'm going to start that way myself. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about Peter, the scholar, the leader, the mover and the shaker, and today the dog's bollocks. Now, dog's bollocks. I was driving along with my friend from England the other day, and there we passed the Dog's Bollocks pub, so I started talking about the dog's bollocks. And she assured me that actually the dog's bollocks is a compliment of the very highest value. And so, of course, I went to Google, Urban Dictionary, Wikipedia, and yes, the dog's bollocks in the UK is a UK slang term for the best. So today, Peter Adams, the dog's bollocks. So Peter was born and bred in Auckland, graduated from University of Auckland in the early 80s, practiced as a clinical psychologist for 13 years, specialising in addictive behaviour and violence. He was a real mover and shaker in these fields, developing many community initiatives. He formed a violence collective, established innovations in mental health and addiction services, and chaired the Problem Gambling Foundation. So he initially joined the university in 1991 to the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioural Science. It was on the 5th floor of Building 503 just above us in those days. In 2000, it was a very large department and was split up into 3 academic sections, and Peter headed up the Applied Behavioural Science section, which was then located in Ferncroft Street. Your school was the faculty was further restructured in 2003 to 2004 and saw the formation of the section of Social and Community Health at the School of Population Health, currently located at Tamaki, and Peter was the head of that section for many years until 2010. He's since been succeeded by Elsie Ho and Janet Farnslow. Now, throughout his prestigious academic career, Peter has focused on areas where individuals are vulnerable, and he's worked tirelessly to improve the lot of the underdog and to reduce harm. Now, alcohol and other drugs issues contribute heavily to the well-being of individuals and families and communities, and he's supported innovative projects that aim to reduce that harm in several ways, through family and neighbourhood responses to addictive relationships, through developing and contributing to specialist practitioner and wider health workforce development, through public health policy and health promotion activities that empower collective responses to risky consumptions, and also, importantly, activities that enhance the role of responsible governance. So Peter, the mover and shaker, has formed many research groups, DART, ADRC, ARN, and recently CFAR, which stands for Centre for Addictions Research. He's headed up the training of Alcohol and Drug Services Brief Intervention Program, the TADS program, through the Goodfellow for many years. You will remember that. He's been a member of the board of Higher Ground, which is an alcohol and drug recovery program, and he's on the National Alcohol and Drug Treatment Workforce Advisory Group to plan the competencies in that workforce. Now, he's also set up Alcohol and Drug Services, and some of you'll know of Lakeshore, which later became part of CADS, the Community Alcohol and Drug Services. So he's spearheaded the training which is developed through the universities in the undergraduate medical program. He was later joined by Ross McCormick, who we all know. With others in the sections, he developed the Alcohol and Drug Certificate and Diploma programs delivered through the School of Population Health. He's supervised many students, he's served on many committees within the university, and he's also served as the Associate Postgraduate Dean of Studies for a period. He's been very influential in the Bachelor of Health Science development and its success. He currently leads the postgraduate redesign for the faculty. Now, the scholar. So Peter, he's a writer of many articles and policy documents, not all of them welcomed by all. So I'll just read you the title of his 3 books, and there's one to come. Gambling, Freedom and Democracy by Routledge in 2007. Fragmented Intimacy, Addiction in a Social World, Springer 2008. Masculine Empire, How Men Use Violence to Keep Women in Line, Dunmore 2012. And the 4th to come from Cambridge University Press, Moral Jeopardy, Risks of Accepting Money from Tobacco, Alcohol and Gambling Industries. Peter the scholar, well established, well respected. He is the faculty's critique and conscience. He's always speaking up in support of social democracy and the moral imperative. He has had a turn leading the Faculty Equity Committee, and he's reminded researchers, university upper echelons, and anyone who will listen about dangerous consumptions, including tainted funds. I'm sure we'll hear some more about this tonight. So Peter the person, steady, fun, and enormous support to me personally as head of school, not least of all because he likes to dress up and dance around at school lunches. Some of you will have had some experience of that. He knows everybody in Auckland, is extremely well connected. He's also a steady support to his co-teachers, co-researchers, and he shepherds many students through difficult times. I personally don't really know what to expect from your inaugural lecture, Peter. I'm sure that I will get a roasting, or at least some in the faculty will, and we'll enjoy it. I know that we'll have a lesson and that we'll be inspired. So Professor Peter Adams, well-deserved professorship, the scholar, the leader, the mover and shaker, and today the dog's bollocks.
Well, I hope this works all right. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right, good. I'm going to talk about It's a beautiful body, isn't it? I was told for an inaugural there were two things. The first thing I was told in the letter was that people have to shut up and listen to me, and they can't ask questions, which is very unusual for my family, which will always interrupt. So you can't interrupt, and you have to believe everything I say. And the other thing was to talk about something I was passionate about, and I thought, well, probably money. Most people are passionate about money, so I thought I'd talk about money. So the main thing I want to cover today, and just invite you to think about, is the link between these two things. Firstly, the misery associated with addictive behaviour, and the second thing is accepting money from tobacco, alcohol and gambling industries. I want to kind of link those two in your mind permanently. So that's my task for tonight. But I need to go back in time. I need to go back to when I first started my academic career. Roll over. Who was it? Jeremy Clarkson. This is and Fred Kroon's here, and this is where I started out studying philosophy. I was studying philosophy. I studied philosophy for 5 years. That's where I started from, and I did a master's in philosophy. And I really loved the whole world of ideas. It was a great place to start from. Except by the end, when I got a Master's of Philosophy, I thought, what the hell am I going to do with that? What do I do? But the only thing that I could think of was becoming a lecturer. And, I thought, my God, I may as well roll over and die. To end up imagine ending up as a lecturer. So like many people my age, I went out at 22. I wanted to save the world. So I went and studied clinical psychology. This is me studying clinical psychology. I was training at the time, and what you'll notice is the red crackerjack gumboots, which when we did training in group therapy, when I took them off, it seemed to have an effect on people for some reason, which was really, really difficult. But after graduating as a clinical psychologist, I did end up working at, this is me at Carrington Hospital. It's my first job, working at Carrington. And I was lucky enough to work in many places, in many, a whole variety of places, community services, institutional services. I worked in West Auckland, South Auckland. I got to know Central Auckland and my own home base, which is the North Shore, really well. And so I was really grateful for that time because I learned a lot from it. And I guess these three things are quite important for my academic career. The first one really taught me to ask questions. The fact that in philosophy you never get an answer to the questions, you just move on to another question is another point. But you ask questions. The second thing I think was, why do people think so strangely? We're pretty weird when you start to pull us apart. We are really weird, and I think psychology gives you an interest in that. And finally, I guess, was more pragmatic. What can we do about things? What can we do to change things was a key thing in my mind. So working as a clinical psychologist is a bit like being at the mouth of a river. Fundamentally, you're dealing with people's misery in all sorts of ways, a whole variety. We seem to be able to become miserable in so many different ways. It's amazing. Mental health problems, trauma, sexual abuse, violence, existential dilemmas, which I'm having now. There's all sorts of ways in which misery appears before you. And of course, you want to do something about it. And one of the areas I stumbled into was addictions. And that's a really cunning way of making people's lives miserable. It really does create misery. I'm not going to really go into it much, and I assume most of you have had friends or family or workmates who've developed addictions in some form or other, and you'll know that how much addictions do cut into relationships and into lives. So what you want to do is do something about it. The other thing I learned as a clinical psychologist was that it's very hard to change, and that most people you try and help, you have a marginal impact. And the best treatments for addictions really only probably about 20 to 30% will change. and out of that, probably about 10 to 15% of those people would have changed any rate. So we're only talking about a 10% margin when it gets down to the end of the river, and that takes a lot of that margin is not big, and it takes a lot of effort to change. So what I'm became much more interested in, is there something upstream? Is there some way that we could look at finding the sources of what pollutes people's lives to some extent? What can we make a difference further upstream? So that's been the focus, I think, for me in the last 20 years, is where can we go upstream to look at making a difference? So I've got to swim upstream. That was the name of the talk, but I'm not very good at swimming. My sister Helen, there she is up there, she's a really good swimmer, and Innes tells me she's following in her wake, so that's really good. But what I prefer to do much more is this, is about paddling upstream. There it is. Oh, there's going back this way. See, when you're paddling, you go faster than a swimmer, but you see lots of things. You see penguins, you see dolphins, and you see sea turtles. I saw a sea turtle last year. Just want you to know. That's very important. But when you look upstream at what's possible, here's me looking upstream. What's possible upstream? There's many spaces that you could go in to look at why misery happens in people's lives. I mean, one of the big ones that we look at in population health is poverty. Another big one is the environment, both the physical but also the social environment that we live in, and how that filters downstream. There's also inequalities, a very important area that our school particularly is interested in. And I guess oppression is another really critical area that I think is important. But one of those streams is addiction. One of those streams that's important in the mix that leads to downstream effects on people's lives is addiction. And I guess that's the one, to some extent, that I've chosen to pursue. So moving upstream and trying to go up the river a little bit, the first area that I got involved in was looking at the role of families when it comes to addiction. And a lot of the treatment services are focused on individuals, very much working with individuals, but I would argue that addiction is a social event, and what's really important in change is what happens in the social context. So working with families is a big area, and it's still an area that I'm involved with, is trying to promote that area. But really it's still not very far upstream. Further upstream, an area that I have worked in a lot over time is working with violence and abuse, particularly violence against women. It's a huge area, and I've been involved with setting up programs and working with men, researching with men. Some of my colleagues are here. It's a really important area. But again, what strikes you over time is people who are committed to violence, it's very hard to change. It's very hard to change. We also, for that area, we need to look further upstream. So one of the areas that I have been involved in a lot is with the area of brief intervention, and that's looking at the power of a brief conversation with a health professional to help people make decisions about their alcohol and drug use. And I've been involved with projects with the WHO on that, and with setting up community-based programs and working with medical students on it. And the one thing about it is that it is effective, it makes a difference. But one of the problems, I guess, with brief intervention is once you stop encouraging people to do it, they stop doing it. So keeping people doing it is one thing that's really, really difficult. So again, going upstream seems to me a better option. So going further upstream into the world of public health. Public health really is finding ways that we can change the environment to help the whole population nudge in the direction of healthy versus unhealthy choices. So that public health has been the area, has offered a lot in the area of addictive consumptions, particularly tobacco, alcohol and gambling. But when you look at the research and the evidence around public health interventions, what strikes you, and there's been a lot of research in the last 70 years in this area, when you start looking at what's effective versus what's less effective, really the most effective interventions are these. Firstly, price is really powerful with tobacco and alcohol. We know that. Availability of a drug is really important. The promotion through television advertising, etc., is really important as well. Product design is also very important. The less effective areas are education, awareness, and behaviour change. They have some impact, but very minimal impact. What gets me, when you look around the world, and including New Zealand, is that when it comes to looking at public health interventions, what governments are willing to fund is on the less effective side, and very little interest on the what's effective side. This is you can watch that pattern over years and years. Something's going on here, and I think it comes back to the role of government here. That government, for some reason, governments are willing to throw buckets of money at ineffective ways of intervening versus effective ways. So, what's going on? Well, I think the critical thing that's happening here is the relationship between the tobacco, alcohol and gambling industries and government. We need to understand that better, because anything else we do in public health is a little bit of a waste of time until we get the chemistry of that right. So there's nothing else you can do. I've got to go further upstream. So here I go again. Have to go further up, and I have to look at the relationship between industry and government. How is it that industry is able to influence government so effectively around the world? Why does that happen? What's going on? And when you think about it, the industry itself can't afford to be seen to be directly influencing government. That would be seen as exploitative and inappropriate. What the industry does, and this is what I'm going to move on to talk about, is that it works through intermediaries. It works through people who are willing to accept money from the industry to act as a bridge between themselves and government. And that's where I've been. This is what my talk is today about, is looking at what's going on here when people take money or accept money from these industries. What role are they playing in the broader picture? So I need to look at a few things. And the first thing I want to say is that addictive consumptions are special. They are a very special form of consumption. And this is a really important point for me. A lot of our economics is based on the idea that it's based on the notion of a rational consumer, that people buy things, that people spend in a marketplace, and they make good decisions and rational decisions. But that doesn't match at all what's happening when you're talking about addictive consumption. Addictive consumers are defined by these things. They have struggles with control, they consume more than they intend to consume, and they overconsume despite knowing the damage. That's what's really, with addictive consumptions, that's what's really perplexing. And those who smoke will know this. It's really perplexing. You know what's going on, but you continue to do it. They overconsume. What that means, overconsumption means lots of money, doesn't it? I mean, if a person's consuming, even though there's less, maybe with gambling, for instance, there's less addicted gamblers, but they spend heaps. And that's really important. Another way of making this point, so what this means is that compared to other consumptions where you have the production costs and the profit, you've got this extra add-on that comes from addictive consumption itself, extra add-on of money. And this extra add-on acts both as an incentive for industry and as the basis to give the capacity. It gives capacity for making it, for pursuing the interests of consumption. Another way of saying this would be to say, if we took the number of alcohol drinkers, alcohol, tobacco and gambling consumers and put them along one axis, and along the other axis we look at profit, if we're looking at ordinary consumption, the gradient would be something like this. Non-addictive consumption might be like that. But with addictive consumption, because of its very nature, it being excessive consumption, the axis is a bit like that. This means that if there is to get an increase in profit for non-addictive consumptions, you need a lot of extra consumers. You need a lot more consumers. To get extra money from addictive consumers, you only need a few extra consumers. So if I was running a business, my interest will be in this rather than the non-addictive consumption, because it only takes a few to increase to make heaps of money. Not only that, but policy, particularly policy that might be informed by good public health, it puts at risk that consumption gains that I've made. So the drop of a few addicted consumers would lead to a huge drop in the amount of money I'd make. So for the addictive consumption industries, it's really important that to manage policy, to make sure that policy doesn't make what I've just talked about possible. One example of this, I think, was recently in the news was El Chapo. He was the cartel boss who was imprisoned in Mexico's highest security prison. He escaped through this tunnel, and the tunnel involves ventilation, it involves lighting, it involves a little train that runs along a railway track. I mean, this is amazing. The amount of money that must be able to, if an illicit drug where you don't have a huge public industry going on can achieve this, then with tobacco, alcohol and gambling, they can tunnel through anything. They can get through right into wherever they want, they've got the capacity. So what I'm interested in is, looking as a psychologist, is what happens? Why do people buy into accepting money from alcohol, tobacco and gambling industry? What's going on? Well, I think when the money's there, it's really hard to resist, isn't it? Because I think, I just got some money in my pocket here. With gambling, argue about, say, half of gambling money comes from people in misery, either through problem gambling or poverty-related impacts on the home. Half of it comes from having fun, from a flutter. So when I put this money down, maybe it's $40, maybe it's $400, maybe it's $4 million, I put it there and in front of someone, they're probably going to say something like, "Ooh, I don't like this misery money. Can I just have the fun money?" I'll say, "No, sorry. It's part of the deal. They both go together. You either take it or leave it." "Okay, I'll take it then." When it's there, it's really hard to resist. And once you accept it once, you create expectations and obligations, and that's reinforced through multiple exchanges. I'll give you an example for me with this. Was the Hood Fund at the University of Auckland had this fund, but introduced about 10 years ago. It's a fund that allows you to bring over, I think at the time it was $30,000, and you could bring a bigwig from the Northern Hemisphere to work with you for maybe a month and develop projects. And we said, "Shit hot, this is fantastic." So our section got together and we were going to bring this expert over from Detroit who was into community development, and we were going to do all these projects with her. It was fantastic. So I went home all steamed up and I started filling out on my computer the application form. So it says nominations for Hood Visiting Fellowship. Name, I could do that. Present position, yep, great. Fields of research, can manage that. Department, that's right, yeah. Oops, right down the bottom, what I ran into was this. Generously supported by the Lion Foundation. It's bloody money from problem gamblers. This is inconvenient, very inconvenient. So what can you do about that? Well, my first response was this. I didn't see that. We've done so much work already, and this is going to be a great project. Just pretend it's not there. And then we won't say anything to anybody, and then we'll find out later on and it's too late. I thought I'd do that. The next response was this. It was a bargaining response because I didn't think I'd get away with that one for long. And this one was kind of, look, maybe gambling's not that bad. It has its positive sides. There's only very few people who have problems with gambling, and we can't spoil it for the rest of us. Peter Dunn was saying that yesterday, I think, something like that. But look, I knew this was industry speak. It's all bullshit. but it's what they say and people believe it. I knew it was wrong, so I had to find another resource. The next resource was more of a missionary response. Was, look, the money's sitting there. It's there. Someone's got to use it. And this funding will save lives. It will make a difference.
On the eve of the adjudicator's arrival, some travellers moved into Callaghan Park. Before you could say gypsy scum, we were knee-deep in dog-muck thieving kids and crusty jugglers.
Crusty jugglers.
We lost it.
Sergeant.
You should be ashamed. Calling yourself a community that cares.
Oh, but we do care, Nicholas.
It's all about the greater good.
The greater good.
How can this be for the greater good?
The greater good.
So, for the greater good, if we need to get rid of gypsy scum and crusty jugglers, we need to do this. So, for the greater good, York Liners, oh, come on, the greater good. For the greater good. Oh, wow. So for the greater good, we have to. And besides, if we don't get it, some other undeserving bastard in physiology or art history who's going to get it, and they're not going to do anything. It's just not fair. Look, we had in our department at the time, we had a unit in tobacco, a unit in gambling, and a unit dealing with alcohol and drugs. So I didn't think I could get away with that. I needed a stronger one, the macho response. The macho response is this: you have to be realistic. You have to do some dirty things and make unpopular choices if you're going to get on in life. Really, if you say no to tobacco, alcohol and gambling, you're going to have to say no to fossil fuels, and then you'll have to say no to pharmaceuticals. And imagine a faculty like ours without pharmaceutical money. We can't afford to let this get out of hand. I think probably what's going on is that my desire to take the money and my values, particularly when the money's there, start to clash. And the messages in my mind tend to favour my ambitions. The ethical perspective is often minimised, and I think to some extent, probably in those times, I need some form of outside reference point to gauge my views in terms of my value system. So the problem is that when it comes down to accepting money, you very often shrink everything down to a simple transaction between me and the donor. But really, there's a much broader context going on, a much wider range of functions that are happening. And I want to touch on this now. I want to kind of look at the wider picture around funding. When we're looking at the relationship between tobacco, alcohol and gambling industries and government, I think what's important to recognise is that there is a chain of connections, a chain of links going on of numbers of people who are accepting money in various ways that enables influence to occur at a government level. And I'm going to describe these chains in terms of three connecting chains. The first chain I call the political chain. This is a low visibility chain, and its primary purposes, firstly, is to establish in people's minds that industry is a legitimate business. Industry is a key player in the vitality of our economy, and it builds and the aim of this chain is to build long-term relations with political actors. So along this chain, first is the multinational corporates have their communication strategies and policies that guide at a local level producer and retail associations like the Hospitality Association, the Brewers Association, etc. In that link, then the lobbying and PR companies work with industry and associations in building relationships with political actors, particularly politicians. In studying this chain, what you find is that the industry is working maybe 10 years ahead. It's a long-term strategy. Relationship building is really important. It's built over long periods of time. Recently, the British Medical Journal has been doing a series of studies on the infiltration, how the liquor industry infiltrated the UK Parliament. Here's the UK Chancellor George Osborne, awarded Beer Drinker of the Year, associated with his helping them out with liquor tax on duties for liquor imports. But one of the things they looked at is the all-party MP beer group. 400 MPs belong to the beer group, and they meet regularly in the Houses of Parliament. And I guess that's a space in which industry people and political actors connect over time. And played a really important role in David Cameron's reversing his promise to introduce minimum unit pricing, which is a very effective way of reducing harmful drinking. And so I think this is what's prompted the British Medical Journal to look at this in more detail. How are these relationships achieved? The second chain that's important is the public good chain. On the public good chain, the purpose here is to convince people that the industry is a good corporate citizen, that the industry is handling the harms, and that it is individuals, not systems, that are responsible for these harms. So on this chain, firstly are the corporate social responsibility programs, very flash investments in maybe AIDS programs in Africa, women's violence programs, all sorts of programs that give industry a profile, and also in the case of overseas aid, helps industry connect with political actors within those countries. The second one is these called social aspects and public relations organisations. I spent a lot of time studying these. There are hundreds around the world. They're very interesting, but primarily they're industry-funded organisations that provide interventions for alcohol and tobacco-related harm, but with a particular focus on individuals and trying to divert attention away from public health interventions. Next is community health and community programs, organisations that, like schools and charities that receive money from tobacco, alcohol and gambling. Next is media coverage to make sure that people know about what's going on. And finally, public consultation. The policymakers connect through select committees, through opinion surveys. All this chain is leading to is positive public attitude towards those industries. The example of the SAPRO is the Drinkwise in Australia. Drinkwise was industry funded, like they all are. They're doing something very visible about harm from alcohol, such as binge drinking, public awareness, alcohol and pregnancy, drink driving, underage drinking, pretty much the same sort of programs that most SAPROs do. But as you can see, they're all focused on individual chain, downloading responsibility to the individual and away from the broader context in which change should be occurring. Finally, and most importantly for this location, is the knowledge chain. This is a moderately visible chain, and the purposes here is to convince people that industry knows its own business best. Industry needs to shape their research agenda, and we need to create a credible pro-consumption knowledge base. So the chains along here, firstly, are priority setting processes, funding, but really the centre of this chain really is researchers and research organisations like universities. It's their engagement that's been critical. And it's looking at how I've been looking at lots of researchers around the world in terms of how they get engaged in these industries. And I think it's a kind of a series of steps that people make. Firstly is the industry handshake. Next is a pilot project that gets funded. It doesn't matter what the hell you do, as long as, it's about establishing a relationship. Next is the offer for more significant money. Then ongoing funding. Then membership of the stable, the industry stable, the tobacco research stable or the alcohol research stable. And the ultimate prize is when you get a credible researcher who can communicate directly in a pro-consumption way with policymakers. I'll just run through a few examples. Ernst Winder was a epidemiologist. He one of the first to link smoking to lung cancer, but he also did research funded by Philip Morris, the major tobacco company, between 1961 and 1990. His handshake started in 1955. He did his pilot in 61. He had $50 million of resources in 69. Then that became regular amounts of money. He then became an important person in the Philip Morris stable and became an important person in speaking out against passive smoking. So he was recruited into that mission. Another example is the Brazilian Arthur Guerra de Andrade in Brazil. He was at the State University of São Paulo. He heads a centre, a SAPRO called CESA. And his handshake started with Ambev, the big liquor giant. By the mid-2000s, he had formed CESA. They were involved with education projects, but then he moved into doing research in CESA. And 90% of his money for research came from the industry. By late 2000s, he was on important boards, and he became a key advisor in Brazil to both state and federal governments. Finally, a gambling example is Howard Schaefer at Harvard. His handshake followed a very similar pattern to the other ones. I'm not going to go right through it, but as you can see, he ends up as a prominent researcher with advising at a government level. I just want to comment on gambling research. It's extraordinary. I can't believe it. Most of the prominent researchers in that field are receiving either personally or their institutions are receiving money from the gambling industry. So the gambling industry practically owns the research in this area. It's a really serious problem, I think, and it's something some of us are trying to do something about. Okay, so what I've been arguing here is that there are three chains that create linkages between the industry and between government sector agencies. These chains, there's a lot of doubling up on them, but there's so many opportunities for an individual to become part or become members of links on those chains. So I thought it probably worth focusing on our own institution and look at some of the ways in which the University of Auckland has engaged with these industries. My first experience was doing my PhD in the psychology department. There was a psychophysiological lab there. When I was there, it did research on sleep, but also did some research on emotional aspects of smoking. It was funded primarily by the tobacco industry, by Philip Morris again, and these were some of the grants that they got from the Philip Morris. As you can see, the typing has improved over the years. Perhaps, I think when Auckland Uni Services got involved, that probably made the difference. I'm not sure. But what was extraordinary there was that no one talked about it. I was there, all this money flowing in, no one talked, we kind of knew. I even shared an office with a postdoc, and he never talked about it either. It was like and I think what that suggests, that this research is very much on the knowledge chain because there's silence about it. This is very different than many of the other forms of engagement the University of Auckland has. The D.B. Brewery's linkages with Leading Light scholarships, the Lion Foundation sponsoring of seminars. Of course, we just enjoyed Goldie wine, so we're part of the industry itself now, God damn it. And also the Hood Fellowship, which I've come back to again, which was from Pokey money. And I think the Hood Fellowship regulations are really interesting. If you look through them, the 12th item in there says this: the lead sponsor of the Lion Foundation should be mentioned in all publicity surrounding the Hood Fellow, including the introduction of public seminars, and the Lion Foundation logo must appear in all publicity materials. This says that this is on the public good chain. It's really important that it's highly visible, the relationship. So that's what's important for the industry in that linkage. For our own faculty, I think some of the engagements that we've had, the Beer, Wine and Spirits Council was an association that represented the industry in New Zealand. The Medical Research Advisory Committee they formed involved many of our senior members of faculty, including the Dean at the time. Also, when that collapsed, the Brewers Association was formed for both Australia and New Zealand, and one of our senior staff was the sole medical advisor for that. And finally, there's been the appointment of the Lion Foundation Chair in Emergency Medicine, funded in conjunction with, it's an appointment in conjunction with with Counties Manukau DHB. And that's a really interesting one. Again, the emphasis on having the term Lion Foundation at the front betrays that this is about the public good chain again. Its visibility is really important. So I've been really interested in what we can do about it. I would treat accepting money from dangerous consumptions as industry money as a dangerous consumption in its own right. And I'm interested in some sort of the kind of interventions we could involve in making a difference. I'll just talk about two of them. The first one is ethical decision-making strategies, and the second one is to do with establishing some sort of benchmarks. The first one, I think what's helpful is to move away from thinking of accepting money as a either or. Either you accept it or you don't. You're clean, you're an angel or you're a devil. I think it's better to think of it as a continuum of risk, that there are various positions that people need to think about where they want. So what's important here is not whether or not, it's at what point, where do you draw the line? So if we looked at the type of consumptions that you could take money from, maybe oil at one end, armaments, depends who you are, Alistair might put it differently, the pharmaceuticals industry, lotteries, porn, pokies, alcohol, all these industries create harm in various ways. You could put the line there, or you might want to shift it along a bit further, or you might want to shift it to there. What's important is that there is some discussion and that you try and work out where you want to position yourself. And I'm most interested in looking at those organisations which enter into high risk and extremely high risk relationships. So one of the strategies that I've developed is the development of a set of indicators that help people work out whether or not these relationships are hazardous or not. The first one is looking at purpose. How do the purposes match? If you're trying to improve the health of the community but you get taking money from alcohol, they don't match that well, I would argue. What is the extent of the relationship? If you move from 5% funding to 10% funding, there's a risk of you being silenced by that. Relevant harm. How harmful is the product? Lotteries compared to pokies. Identifies how visible having DB on your rugby jersey or not. How visible is the relationship? And finally, what is the directness of the link? Are you getting money directly or is it going through another body? This, what I've called a peril analysis, has been used around the world in different places to try and help people estimate the extent at which they get on. It allows you to do this sort of thing, is to look, if you're looking at low risk to extremely high risk, so if we take one group, a public health researcher receiving funds directly from a tobacco company in a publicly visible way, well, you've got pretty harmful product, you've got visibility, you've got a real clash of purpose going on. So that's, I would argue, is extremely high risk. And some of the others are also reasonably high risk to extremely high risk. One of the points here I want to make is that these examples are all research examples. It seems to me when you look at the role of researchers in universities, the risks are too high, I would argue, when you start looking at them closely in terms of taking money from these sources. So I think that we need to question these relationships and look at maybe developing some sort of policy position. If the university is engaging with industry money, firstly, it supports the industry legitimacy and policy. It adds to the public credibility of industry. It influences what and how knowledge is assembled. And in terms of critical and conscious speaking, personally, it promotes fear of speaking out. It makes it difficult to speak out openly about things. So I would advocate for a traffic light approach where we have some classes of consumption that we curtail at a university level. We have a policy of not receiving money from tobacco, armaments, pokies and alcohol. We look at some, as they do in many universities in the States, have some way of managing other types of dangerous consumptions and maybe having a conflicts of interest committee that handles that. And finally, we maybe look at pornography or plastic surgery. You might put these in different classes, but it's simply a matter of monitoring those relationships. So what I hope I've done is connect in your minds the act of accepting money from industry and the relationship with the miseries associated with addictive consumption. I hope I've made that connection. But before I finish, I just want to make a few acknowledgements of people in the past. I haven't got much time, but I'll just touch on a few. First one, was someone when I started university, a very famous philosopher of science, Paul Feyerabend, came to Auckland. He came for 2 winters and lectured. He really sparked up an interest in ideas for me. And at the tender age of 18, he really convinced me that science is a form of myth-making with very interesting forms of propaganda involved. Also, I want to acknowledge Clive Pearson, who taught in the philosophy department, and I studied under him for 5 years. And he taught Martin Heidegger, but really it was Clive he taught, and many of us were inspired by Clive's teaching. When I thought about psychology, I couldn't think of anyone really who inspired me, but the people that did inspire me were clients, and particularly colleagues who've come through recovery processes themselves. People like Ken and Len and Ralph and Jill. These people I worked side by side with who were in recovery themselves taught me so much about addiction, about humility, about all sorts of things that go with that territory. So they were very inspiring. When it comes to health, I think probably the people that I really have learnt so much off have been the people who've done PhDs with me. I've had the privilege to supervise over 25 PhDs. These are some of the faces, some of them, and I don't think they realise how much of a journey it is for me. You know, that each one is an adventure, and I learn heaps as well. I mean, they're worried about, you know, the work in that, but I'm enjoying the whole ride. It's it's been a great privilege working with you guys. I think I want to acknowledge my family. I think some of them are here. This is my brothers and sisters and their partners, and also our offspring. Some of them are here too. Have a yo from the clan. No, they're here, right? Great. I particularly want to acknowledge 2 people: my mother Nellie and my father Bob. Mum's here. Dad passed away 3 years ago, and we still miss him a lot. But I also really want to acknowledge my own children, my 4 children, and my partner Jude. Jude's here somewhere, and Jude has put up with me for a hell of a long time. She's been a great support, and a lot of what I've done wouldn't be possible without her, so I just want to acknowledge her support during these years with 4 children. Where to next? Well, I've still got a lot of paddling to do, but really, I'm going a bit bald, and my hair's gone grey, and I'm getting fat, and I'm getting all wrinkly. So these are all signs that I'm not going to live forever. It's a bit of a shock, but I'm not going to live forever. So I do want to achieve a few things before I snuff it. And one thing that was difficult was when we're meant to write articles here, and 3,000 word articles. Well, sometimes people write fewer words, but I find, jeepers, to write 3,000 words, what can you say in 3,000 words? This is an issue, I did this, I got that, this is what it means, and that's that. No. It's just not enough space. Give me land, lots of land, and the sunny sky above. Don't fence me, and I just have to say that. What I have become, about 8 years ago, I switched to writing books. So instead of 3,000 words, 133,000 words. Now that's space, that's great. It's really gives you lots of space to look at an issue in its complexity. You can't in an article look at the complexity of some of these issues. So to be able to write or the whole, you know, write it, I don't know if anyone reads it, but to write it is fantastic. And so I started with this book, my second book, which was on addiction and as a social event. My third book and Charmian's here, the publisher, thank you for coming, for this book, Masculine Empire, how to keep your woman in line. And finally, this is the book that's coming out later this year, Moral Jeopardy, Risks to Accepting Money for Tobacco. I'm going to be sued. I'm not really worried about this one, but it's coming out and you're all going to buy it and read it, aren't you? I've written another couple of books which I'd like to get published, and I've started a couple this year that are really mad, but they're keeping me happy. I'm going to keep working with the Centre for Addiction Research. We've got such a great group. The management team that I work with, Janie, David, Susanna, Natalie and Denise, we work closely together and it's great working with them. But also on the broader front, connecting with the agencies that we work closely with, Odyssey House, CADS, Problem Gambling Foundation, High Ground, the Salvation Army and Mataraki are some of the agencies that we connect with out there. And Rebecca, I forgot to mention Alcohol Health Watch, I'm sorry. But these agencies are ones that we work with and really value. But I guess the home base is the School of Population Health, and we have got such a wonderful group of people there, such a diverse and wonderful group of people. So it's been a great privilege working with people in the school. So, I've not got much time left. So my trajectory has been this. I started in the world of ideas, in the world of philosophy, and for the first 20 years it's been one of tracking downstream, right down to the downstream, and then in the second half of my career, the next 20 years has been going upstream. And really where I've come to, I think, is into this crater lake, which is the world of ideas but I've come back to that lake with all the other equipment that I from downstream, a concern about what can work, a concern for how do we change issues around misery, and I want to explore this lake of ideas a lot more. I've got lots of more paddling to do, and also I want to take people with me. So one of the courses I've established is Peter's Wonderful World of Theory. That's what I call it, but I think it's called something else rather boring. But that's the course I teach to honours students and PhD students, and it's just I think the world of ideas is the fountainhead. It's the source of so much of what we do in academia, and yet we neglect it. And I want to bring attention back to that world. So I don't know how to finish these talks, but I thought I'd finish with just a quote my grandfather used to tell me when I was a boy. He said this: "I have lived to bury my desires. I've seen my dreams corrode in dust." I got it in there, Mum. And I'm not sure what he's trying to tell me at that age, but I'm a lot clearer now what he's on about. And yes, thank you very much for all of you for coming.
Congratulations, Peter. My name's Mark Barrow. I'm the Associate Dean Academic, and I was very honoured when Peter asked me if I'd give the vote of thanks, and I wondered why. But I guess it's because Peter has been one of those people who's been very influential in arguing with me and dragging me into his wonderful world of theory. And some people belong to book groups, but there's a group of us, I've only been to it once, but we're going to do it a lot more, that meet at the School of Population Health to look into all sorts of theories. So we've got a list of people we're going to look at, and we terrify each other by trying to read the text and then argue about what they mean. So thank you, Peter, for a wonderful speech. I guess I saw some of Peter's notes, and so I knew what he was going to say, but and then it made me think, so what should I say to sum up? And I think it is, democratic societies like ours enshrine the idea of academic freedom in legislation and law. And we do this because we believe that it is good for the academy and society to encourage academics, particularly professors, I guess, to examine and hold and advance controversial ideas and to challenge the status quo. As Peter assumes the mantle of Professor, I think we can all be pretty sure that his status to confront us with difficult and controversial ideas won't go away. Some of this might make us uncomfortable, but don't let that stop you, Peter. And I guess I do know that sometimes it makes Peter uncomfortable and worried, but I say, kia kaha, Peter, keep it up. So all it remains for me to do is to thank you all for coming and to thank Peter Adams, Professor Peter Adams, for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you very much, Mark, Nari, and of course thank you very much, Peter, for a wonderfully enlightening and challenging inaugural lecture. So it's left to me to close the formal proceedings, and I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight and just remind you that next Tuesday we have our next inaugural lecture, which is Professor Chris Print. So I hope to see you there, and thank you for coming. Good night.